At 9:35 on the morning of March 13, 2006, a single-engine aircraft touched down in the Pacific Ocean, about 600 feet southwest of the Santa Monica Pier. Witnesses on the beach would later describe what they saw as a controlled descent. Not a spiral, not a dive. The pilot, they said, seemed to know exactly what he was doing. The Beechcraft Bonanza. A 36 registration number N16JR glided toward the water at a shallow angle, nose slightly up, wings level. It was, by all accounts, a textbook water landing. The kind they teach you in flight school. The kind that saves lives. And yet, when Coast Guard divers reached the wreckage less than 15 minutes later, floating upside down in just 19 feet of water, they found two bodies inside. The fuselage was largely intact. The cabin had not collapsed. The doors could still be opened. But Peter Tomarken, 63 years old, and his wife Kathleen, 41, were already gone. The official cause of death, according to the Los Angeles County coroner, was blunt force trauma. The question that would haunt investigators, aviation experts, and anyone who studied the case was simple. How does a pilot execute a textbook emergency landing, keep the aircraft intact, and still lose everyone on board? The answer, according to the National Transportation Safety Board, came down to a single piece of metal smaller than a human thumb. A cotter pin. A tiny safety wire designed to keep critical engine components in place. The NTSB concluded that this pin was missing from the connecting rod assembly, causing catastrophic engine failure shortly after takeoff. Case closed. Mechanical failure. Tragedy. Except the report never explained when that pin went missing. Or how. Or who was responsible for checking it during the maintenance inspection that happened just 3 weeks earlier. Those details, for reasons that remain unclear, were never fully investigated. But before we get to the questions that were never answered, you need to understand who was on that plane. Because if you grew up watching American television in the 1980s, you already know his face. You know that smile. You know that voice, counting down the spins and cheering alongside contestants as they shouted the most famous catchphrase in game show history. Big bucks, no whammies. Peter Tomarken was the host of Press Your Luck, the CBS game show that ran for 3 seasons and became a cultural phenomenon. He was there in 1984 when a man named Michael Larson memorized the board patterns and won over $110,000 in a single episode, the biggest one-day haul in game show history at the time. He was there when the network scrambled to figure out if Larson had cheated. He was there for all of it. And in 2003, nearly 20 years later, Peter came back to narrate the documentary about that scandal, a film that broke ratings records on the game show network. But by 2006, Peter Tomarken had found something more important than television. He had found purpose. He and Kathleen were volunteers with Angel Flight West, a nonprofit organization that provides free air transportation for patients who need medical treatment but cannot afford to fly. On the morning of March 13th, they were headed to San Diego to pick up a 58-year-old cancer patient named Raymond, who needed a ride to UCLA Medical Center for his 3rd round of treatment. They never made it, and Raymond waited at the airport, watching the clock, until someone told him the news. To understand the magnitude of what was lost that morning in Santa Monica Bay, you have to go back to the beginning, not to the game shows. Not to the lights and the cameras and the spinning boards, but to a small town in western New York called Olean, where Peter David Tomarken was born on December 7, 1942. His parents, Barnett and Pearl, owned a modest jewelry store called Dee's Jewelry on Main Street. They were Jewish, members of Temple B'nai Israel, part of a tight-knit community where everyone knew everyone. Peter was the middle son, the one with the easy smile and the quick wit, the kid who could talk to anyone about anything. When the family relocated to Beverly Hills in the early 1950s, chasing the California dream like so many others, Peter found himself in a world that could not have been more different from the one he left behind. He graduated from Beverly Hills High School in 1960, then earned a bachelor's degree in English from UCLA. Not exactly the typical path to television stardom. In fact, for the first decade of his adult life, Peter Tomarken had no interest in show business at all. He moved to New York City in the late 1960s and worked as an editor for Women's Wear Daily and Business Week, serious publications for serious people. He got married, had 3 children, Jason and twin daughters Alexis and Candace, and seemed perfectly content with a quiet life behind the scenes. Then he moved back to California, started his own advertising firm, and everything changed. The story of how Peter Tomarken became a game show host is, in many ways, the most Peter Tomarken story imaginable. He was doing well in advertising, appearing in commercials for his own clients, when his agent suggested he try out for game shows. Peter's response was immediate and skeptical. "Why would I want to do that?" he asked. His agent smiled and gave him the only answer that mattered. "Because you work 4 days a month and get paid 6 figures." Peter auditioned. He failed twice, hosting pilots for NBC that never got picked up. But in 1983, a producer named Bill Carruthers saw something in him and hired him to host a new show called Press Your Luck. It was a simple concept. Contestants answered trivia questions to earn spins on a giant electronic board. The board had cash, prizes, and extra spins, but it also had the whammy, a mischievous cartoon character who would take everything you had earned if you landed on him. The show became a sensation. For 3 seasons on CBS, Peter Tomarken stood at that podium and watched ordinary Americans scream, "Big bucks, no whammies," at the top of their lungs, hoping luck would be on their side. He was warm without being fake, funny without being cruel, and genuinely happy when contestants won. When the show ended in 1986, Peter moved on to other projects: Bargain Hunters, Wipeout, Paranoia, none of them matching the success of Press Your Luck. By the late 1990s, the game show era was fading, and Peter found himself at a crossroads. He could have chased the spotlight. He could have fought for another hosting gig, another moment in front of the cameras. Instead, he did something unexpected. He became a real estate agent. He remarried, this time to a woman named Kathleen, 22 years his junior, who shared his quiet desire to do something meaningful with their time. And together, they discovered Angel Flight West. The organization was simple in its mission and profound in its impact. Volunteer pilots used their own planes, paid for their own fuel, and donated their time to transport patients who needed medical care but had no way to get there. Cancer patients traveling to specialists. Children needing surgeries their local hospitals could not perform. Families too poor to afford a plane ticket that might save their lives. Peter and Kathleen flew dozens of missions over the years. They never asked for recognition. They never sought publicity. His agent, Fred, would later tell reporters that in those final years, what really made Peter light up was not talking about television. It was talking about the people he had helped, the lives he had touched, the difference he was making one flight at a time. On the morning of March 13, 2006, Peter and Kathleen were scheduled to fly to San Diego to pick up a man named Raymond, 58 years old. Advanced cancer. 3rd round of treatment at UCLA Medical Center. Raymond had no idea that the man coming to save him was a television legend. He just knew that someone was coming, that someone cared. The 72 hours before the crash began like any other weekend. On Friday, March 10th, Peter received a call from the Angel Flight West Coordination Center. A mission was available for Monday morning. A cancer patient in San Diego needed transport to UCLA Medical Center. Peter checked the weather forecast, looked at his calendar, and said yes. What he did not know What he could not have known was that he was not the first choice for this flight. A volunteer pilot named Melanie had been originally scheduled. She had flown this route before, knew the airports, knew the timing. But a family commitment came up at the last minute, and she had to cancel. Peter offered to take her place. Years later, Melanie would tell a local newspaper that she thinks about that decision every single day. "It should have been me on that plane," she said. "I gave up my seat, and 2 people died." Saturday, March 11th, passed without incident. Peter spent the day at home with Kathleen, going over the details of the mission, double-checking the logistics. He had been a licensed private pilot for more than a decade, with hundreds of hours logged in his Beechcraft Bonanza. Flying was not a hobby for Peter. It was a discipline. He treated every flight with the same seriousness, whether he was carrying passengers or flying solo. That afternoon, a fellow pilot named Dean stopped by to chat. Dean was something of a mechanic himself, the kind of guy who liked to tinker with engines and keep his hands dirty. He offered to take a look at Peter's plane, just a quick once-over before the Monday flight. Peter declined. "The plane went through a full inspection 3 weeks ago," he said. "It is in perfect shape." Dean nodded and did not push the issue. He had no reason to. The inspection records were up to date. The paperwork was clean. What neither of them knew was that the mechanic who performed that last inspection would leave the company just 2 weeks later. His reasons for leaving were never made public, and the question of what he did or did not check during that final maintenance visit would never be fully answered. Sunday, March 12th, was the calm before the storm. Peter called Douglas, the mission coordinator at Angel Flight West, to confirm the details. Takeoff was scheduled for 9:20 in the morning. The route was straightforward: Santa Monica to San Diego to pick up Raymond, then back to UCLA Medical Center. Total flight time, maybe 2 hours round trip. The weather forecast for Monday was perfect. Clear skies, light winds, unlimited visibility. Ideal conditions for a small aircraft. That evening, Kathleen made a decision that would haunt everyone who loved her. She had not originally planned to join the flight. Peter often flew these missions alone or with another volunteer. But something made her change her mind. Maybe she wanted to meet Raymond in person. Maybe she just wanted to spend the morning with her husband. Whatever the reason, she told Peter she was coming along. He smiled and said he would be glad to have her. Monday morning arrived with the kind of golden California sunshine that makes people believe nothing bad can happen. Peter woke before dawn, ran through his mental checklist, reviewed the flight plan one more time. At 5:30, he was already thinking about the day ahead. At 7, Raymond called from San Diego to confirm he would be at the airport by 11. His voice was tired but hopeful. This was his 3rd round of treatment. The first 2 had gone well. He had every reason to believe the 3rd would be the same. At 9:05, Peter and Kathleen arrived at Santa Monica Airport. A ground crew worker named Travis saw them walking toward the hangar. He waved. Peter waved back. "We are picking up someone special in San Diego," Peter said. "See you in a few hours." Those were the last words Travis ever heard him speak. At 9:20, the Beechcraft Bonanza received clearance for takeoff. Peter pushed the throttle forward, the engine roared to life, and the wheels left the ground. 15 minutes later, everything fell apart. The Beechcraft Bonanza was climbing through somewhere between 500 and 1,000 feet when the engine failed. There was no warning. No gradual loss of power. No sputtering or coughing that might have given Peter a few extra seconds to react. One moment the 6-cylinder Continental engine was running at full power, and the next moment it was not. According to the National Transportation Safety Board, the failure was catastrophic and instantaneous. A connecting rod inside the engine block fractured, punched a hole through the crankcase, and destroyed any chance of recovery. The preliminary report described what investigators found when they examined the wreckage. A hole in the engine case, the document stated, with portions of the connecting rod visible through the opening. The connecting rod and the connecting rod cap were fractured from the rod end. In simpler terms, the heart of the engine had torn itself apart from the inside out. Peter Tomarken, with more than a decade of flying experience, now had seconds to make a decision that would determine whether he and Kathleen lived or died. A surfer named Marcus was sitting on his board about 300 yards from shore when he heard the sound. It was not the roar of a healthy engine. It was a cough, then a sputter, then silence. He looked up and saw the small white plane descending toward the water. It was not spinning, Marcus would later tell investigators. It was not diving. The wings were level. The nose was up just a little. It looked like the pilot knew exactly what he was doing. A woman named Lorraine, who lived in an apartment building overlooking the beach, heard something different. There was a noise like a muffled explosion, she said. Then nothing. Then sirens. What both witnesses described without knowing it was the textbook response to an engine failure over water. Peter did not panic. He did not try to turn back to the airport, a maneuver that kills more pilots than almost any other. He assessed his options, realized he could not make it back to solid ground, and aimed for the ocean. He executed what pilots call a controlled ditching, bringing the aircraft down at the lowest possible speed, at the shallowest possible angle, with the wings perfectly level to maximize the chances of survival. At 9:35, the Beechcraft Bonanza touched the surface of Santa Monica Bay, approximately 600 feet southwest of the pier. The impact was hard, but not catastrophic. The fuselage held together. The cabin did not collapse. The plane flipped upside down as it settled into the water, but it remained largely intact. This is where the story stops making sense. Coast Guard rescue boats reached the crash site within minutes. A diver named Tyler was among the first to descend into the 19 feet of murky water where the aircraft had come to rest. He found the plane inverted, its white belly facing the sky, its wheels pointing uselessly toward the clouds. The cabin door could still be opened. The structure had not crumpled. In a water landing like this one, with a skilled pilot at the controls and an intact fuselage, the survival rate is remarkably high. People walk away from these accidents. They climb out of the wreckage, swim to the surface, and live to tell the story. But when Tyler opened that door, he found Peter and Kathleen still strapped in their seats. They had not drowned. They had not burned. The official cause of death, according to the Los Angeles County coroner, was blunt force trauma. The question that would puzzle aviation experts for years was simple and devastating. If the plane was intact, if the landing was controlled, if everything went as well as it possibly could have gone under the circumstances, why did they die? The NTSB report offered an explanation for the engine failure, but remained strangely silent on the question of survivability. Investigators concluded that a cotter pin, a small piece of safety wire less than an inch long, was missing from the connecting rod assembly. This pin is designed to keep a critical nut in place. Without it, the nut can loosen over time, the connecting rod can shift, and eventually the whole assembly can fail catastrophically. Case closed, according to the official narrative. A tiny piece of missing metal caused a chain reaction that brought down the plane. But a former NTSB investigator named Barrett, who reviewed the case independently, pointed to a glaring omission. The report identifies the missing cotter pin as the probable cause, Barrett said. But it never explains when that pin went missing. Was it missing from the factory? Did it fall out during the last maintenance inspection 3 weeks before the crash? Did someone forget to install it? These are basic questions, and the report does not answer them. More troubling, it does not appear that anyone even asked. The mechanic who performed that final inspection was never publicly identified. The maintenance records were reviewed but not scrutinized. The question of responsibility simply evaporated into bureaucratic silence. Then there was the toxicology report. The NTSB document mentioned, almost in passing, that substances were found in Peter Tomarken's system. The exact nature of these substances was not specified. The report stated only that the effect of the drugs on the pilot's decision-making is not clear. This single sentence raised more questions than it answered. If the substances were irrelevant, common medications like blood pressure pills or cholesterol drugs that millions of Americans take every day, why mention them at all? And if they were relevant, if they might have impaired Peter's judgment or reaction time, why was there no detailed analysis? A private aviation consultant named Glenn, who asked to remain anonymous, put it bluntly. Either the drugs mattered or they did not. If they mattered, we deserve to know exactly what they were and how they might have affected the pilot. If they did not matter, then including that line in the report is irresponsible because it casts doubt on a man who cannot defend himself. The NTSB never clarified. The question of what was in Peter's system and whether it played any role in the tragedy remains officially unanswered. And then there is the pattern that no one wants to talk about. The Beechcraft Bonanza is one of the most popular single-engine aircraft in American aviation history. It has been in continuous production since 1947, longer than any other airplane in the world. Tens of thousands have been built. But the Bonanza also has one of the highest fatal accident rates of any aircraft in its class. Between the 1970s and 2010, the model was involved in hundreds of fatal crashes. Some pilots call it the doctor killer, because so many wealthy professionals, people who could afford the plane but did not always have the experience to fly it safely, died at the controls. Defenders of the aircraft argue that the statistics are misleading. The Bonanza is so popular, they say, that of course it appears in more accidents. It is simply a matter of numbers. Critics counter that popularity does not explain the disproportionate fatality rate, that something about the design, perhaps the handling characteristics, perhaps the way it responds in emergencies, makes it less forgiving than other planes. The truth, as always, probably lies somewhere in between, but the question lingers. If Peter Tomarken had been flying a different aircraft that morning, would the outcome have been the same? While Peter and Kathleen Tomarken were taking their last breaths in the waters of Santa Monica Bay, a 58-year-old man named Raymond was sitting in the passenger terminal at San Diego International Airport, watching the clock on the wall. His bag was packed with everything he needed for another round of chemotherapy. His paperwork was in order. His hope was intact. The volunteers from Angel Flight West had told him to expect the plane around 11 in the morning. 11 came and went. Then 11:30. Then noon. Raymond assumed there had been a delay, maybe weather, maybe traffic at the airport. He had no way of knowing that the people coming to save him were already gone. He found out from a television in the terminal. A local news broadcast interrupted its regular programming to report that a small plane had crashed into the ocean near Santa Monica. 2 fatalities. The pilot was identified as a former game show host. Raymond did not immediately make the connection. Then someone showed him a photograph of Peter Tomarken, and the world stopped moving. "They were coming to get me," Raymond would later tell a reporter, his voice barely above a whisper. "They died because of me." It was not true, of course. Peter and Kathleen died because an engine failed, because a cotter pin was missing, because a chain of events no one could have predicted, aligned in the worst possible way. But guilt does not operate on logic. Raymond carried that weight for years. He eventually found another way to get to UCLA. He completed his treatment. He survived. But the thought of what happened that morning never left him. The news of Peter Tomarken's death spread quickly. Entertainment Tonight, the same show that had covered his career for decades, was the first to break the story nationally. His agent Fred spoke to reporters about the man he had known for so many years. "He was always a fun guy to be around," Fred said. "He just loved the genre of game shows. But what really made him happy in those last years was helping people." The game show community mourned one of its own. Angel Flight West established the Peter and Kathleen Tomarken Heroes Fund in their honor, a permanent tribute to two people who gave their lives in service to strangers. Peter's 3 children from his first marriage, Jason, Alexis, and Candace, were left to bury a father whose final act was one of selflessness. His ex-wife Dana, with whom he had remained on good terms, grieved privately. And somewhere in San Diego, Raymond sat alone with a debt he could never repay. Nearly 2 decades have passed since that March morning, and Peter Tomarken has not been forgotten. Reruns of Press Your Luck still air on cable television. A new version of the show, hosted by Elizabeth Banks, has been running on ABC since 2019. In 2024, a film called The Luckiest Man in America was released, telling the story of Michael Larson, the man who memorized the board and won over $110,000. Peter Tomarken is portrayed by actor Walton Goggins. Decades after his death, he is still part of the cultural conversation, still connected to a moment in television history that refuses to fade. But the legacy that matters most is not the one measured in ratings or box office receipts. It is the legacy of a man who could have spent his retirement chasing fame, collecting speaking fees, living off the nostalgia of a generation that grew up watching him on television. Instead, he chose to fly strangers to hospitals. He chose to use his own plane, his own money, his own time, to make a difference in lives he would never fully know. The official story says Peter Tomarken died because of a missing cotter pin. And maybe that is the whole truth. Maybe it was just an accident, a mechanical failure, a tragedy with no deeper meaning. But the official story also leaves too many questions unanswered. It does not explain when that pin went missing or who was supposed to check it. It does not explain why the toxicology findings were mentioned but never clarified. It does not explain why 2 people died in a crash that, by all accounts, they should have survived. The evidence does not prove conspiracy, but it does prove that important questions were never asked, and important answers were never found. Today, the Santa Monica Pier is still crowded with tourists taking photographs, children eating ice cream, couples watching the sunset over the Pacific. Almost none of them know that 600 feet from where they stand, in water shallow enough to see the bottom, 2 people lost their lives trying to save a third. Peter Tomarken spent years making Americans shout, "Big bucks, no whammies," at their television screens. He made millions of people smile. But in the end, what defined him was not luck. It was the choice to spend his final years helping strangers who had no one else to turn to. The question that remains is not about the missing pin or the unanswered inconsistencies in the report. The question is about us. How many of us would do the same?